In this video, we're going to use Fusion 360 Forms to reverse engineer a complex scan, so stay tuned. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to carry on this series, but in this case, we're going to talk about using Freeform tools to do what we did in episode 1. In that part, what we did was we created mesh section sketches, and we lofted to create this shape. Now, what we're going to be doing is the same exact thing. We're going to look at about the same section of this part, but we're going to use Freeform tools, see how quick it is, and see if the quality of our surfaces are any better. So if you want to follow along, you can start at the first video and you can follow along creating this solid body, or you can go to the description of this video and download this data set that already contains that lofted solid body. So this process is not going to take 30 minutes like we did with the loft version. So I'm going to keep it pretty short and just show you how powerful this tool is to get us some good quality surfaces. So to get started, we're going to go to Create Form. And the form type that I'm going to use is a cylinder. We need to go ahead and just create a cylinder, approximate size, and instead of doing 4 cross sections, I'm just going to do 1. And then we need to position this. So from the top, I'm going to just select it, go to my Modify Edit Form, and I want to just simply put it about in the right position. So again, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be sort of replicating that same part of the lever. Now, if this is a little bit big, we can scale it down. It doesn't actually have to be perfect. We're not going to go through the process like we've done with other pieces where we've spent the time making individual faces and connecting them. In this case, it's going to be really quick, I promise. So we're going to double click this edge, hold down the Alt key, get this little dialog out of the way, hold down the Alt key, and sort of pull this out. Now, normally, I don't work with smooth display, but in this case, it's fine. And I'm just going to scale it down, noting that this is doing it in plane. It's scaling down in plane. Not a perfect solution, but again, we don't need to be perfect here. I'm going to rotate this around. And you know what? I'm not even going to scale it anymore. I'm going to just show you how easy this is. Keep using Alt, rotating this around. We want to get approximately an even layout of these edges. It doesn't have to be perfect again, but we're just going to get kind of close and say OK. Now we're pretty much done, right? We only have a couple of other steps to do to make this work. So we're going to pull this down. What we want is it to be completely around. Think about taking a piece of shrink tubing or just some sort of tubing and slipping it over something. This is what we're looking for. Now, if we want to, we can scale it down and we can start to scale it vertically and we can get it kind of close. The closer it is to the mesh, generally the better results you'll get. It's not really required, but we do want to make sure that it's completely on the outside of it. With the entire thing selected, we're going to go to Modify, Pull, and allow it to automatically pull down to the surface. We're going to be using surface points. Those are the ones on our smooth display, and we're going to say OK. Now, again, this is not a perfect solution, but if we hide the mesh body, that looks pretty good. I mean, it's not perfect, but that looks pretty good. So what we're going to do is we're going to make some sort of minor adjustments. I'm going to take this endpoint and just simply pull it back a little bit. And overall, that looks pretty good. I'm going to just select everything again. I'm going to use pull one more time. Remembering that this is a direct editing, it is it's destructive in nature because we're directly modifying things. Before I go any further, I'm going to take this one and just copy and paste it. I want an exact copy of it. I'm just going to leave that one alone. And what we're going to do is select everything. I'm going to go to Modify and Subdivide. We're going to be using Exact because this will keep the current shape. I'm going to go to Specify. I'm going to hide the mesh. And the reason I want to go to Specify is because we don't necessarily want to add a ton of extra cross sections this way unless we need to capture the shape. But what we want to do is we want to potentially have more cross sections along the length of this to get us a little bit better, a better attachment. So I'm just going to sort of subdivide it, which evenly adds a bunch of lines and it keeps the same shape. But once again, I'm just going to take all of that, go to Modify, pull, this gives me just a couple more data points. So now if I hide the mesh, I've got this, this version, Control and 4 to hide the edges, and that looks pretty good. So it might not appear perfect, and there might be areas where we have, for instance, those casting marks on the bottom that could be causing problems. But overall, we now have two bodies. They should be relatively close. One of them has more edges, and you can kind of see they're slightly different. So basically what you need to do here is you need to add enough edges to capture the detail that you need, but not too much that it's just really pulling down to that mesh. Because remember, the mesh is not perfect. It has a bunch of highs and lows. Even if we do a super smooth on it in the mesh software or in Fusion, it's still going to have those highs and lows. When we finish this, now what we're left with are surfaces. So this first surface was kind of the lower res one, and the second surface should be a little bit closer, so you can see that there is a small difference between these two edges. But what we really want to look at is that original body. I'm going to use M on the keyboard and just move that down. Going to do Control and 4 to hide the edges. And what we want to look at here is just the difference between the two. Now remember, this lofted one took us quite a bit of time. We ended up spending about half an hour in that video. I did speed up a few points on it, but it took us a good bit of time because we had to build all of these mesh sections. We had to convert the mesh sections to different cross sections. And eventually we did get something. Now if we go to our curvature map analysis and I select both of these, what you're going to see is that the version that comes from Forms is going to be cleaner. And what I mean by that is you'll notice, for example, in this area, we have some reds and oranges and greens, but down here we've got a bunch of changes in color. So these are these high and low points. The colors are essentially going to be indicating the curvature. Now, if we look at the lofted one here that's done with Forms, that section where there's a transition is all purple, where this one has a bunch of these red highlights coming through, and they've got green edges next to them. And what all this means is that when we go to do additional work on the lofted one that comes from those mesh sections, we're going to end up having potential problems. And to highlight this, there's actually a comment on the first video that said, once you start offsetting the surfaces, you start to run into problems. And that is 100% true. And if we go to create an offset and I select this and I start pulling this out, I'm just going to kind of make it, let's see, 5 millimeters should be okay. I'm going to change its color so maybe it's a little bit easier to see. And basically what we end up having, if we go to our curvature map analysis again, what we should see is that some of those issues or errors that we had are just getting worse. The bigger this thing gets, there's now the seam in the middle where it left that seam. These problems are starting to get worse, and it's just, overall it's just not a good solution. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this one down to give me a little bit more room. I'm going to hide the solid, and then I'm going to take this one that came from the Freeform model, and I'm going to offset it 5 millimeters as well. Now when I offset this one 5 millimeters, let me give it a different appearance. By no means is this going to be a perfect solution. Both of these are going to have their own problems. But what we see here is that the curvature map, and it's probably a better way for me to do this. Let me go ahead and move this one up as well so that we can kind of just see them all. So if we take a look at the curvature map analysis between those two, they're basically the same. There is no difference between them. There are, of course, some of these areas get bigger. So for example, the purple on this corner, that is essentially a radius there. You can see that it's getting bigger here. But the overall shape of all of these different areas looks exactly the same. When we go to start offsetting the lofted version with the mesh section sketches, it looks largely the same, but what ends up happening is these areas where we have a big change in curvature in a small area, as we start to make this thing bigger, they start to overlap. Those areas start to overlap and they start to produce bigger problems downstream. Now, again, it all comes back to what are you going to do with this downstream? So if you're going to try to machine something, then you have to think about what those end those end goals or those end results look like. But you do start to see these in renders when you look at reflections and how the reflections are hitting different parts. And for example, right here, this is a good one. You can kind of see there's a little bit of a disjoint that happens right here in this reflection. It sort of gets light and then it gets dark again. And when we take a look at the freeform version of that, we don't get that same sort of ripple in the surface. So we can see a lot of those. And it's not the fault of the surface tool that we're using. It's not the loft tool. It's the curves that we're using from those mesh sections. That's where this problem is coming from. And you kind of see the same thing here. It probably doesn't come across on the screen very well, but the shadow here is sort of bumpy. It's sort of jumping around. And when we look at the shadow on the lofted version, the offset one here, you can see that it's fairly consistent. It dips in here where we've got a transition, it stays fairly straight, and it dips in again where we have that transition. And when we go to the original size version, it's actually quite a bit smoother. It looks a little bit better there. So, again, I wanted to highlight this as a quick process because the freeform model took us a whole lot less time. We can do it in the matter of a minute or two. If you're, proficient with these tools, you can build that out pretty quickly. And it doesn't take that much time, and we get a good quality surface. Now, this would allow us to continue to build the rest of the design. We don't necessarily have to do this with the freeform tools the entire way, but if we decided to go back in and say continue to work on this, what we could do is we could continue adding and using pull, or potentially just using extrude, or in this case alt, and begin dragging this out, scaling it out, getting it approximate, and again holding down alt, scaling it out, and just sort of getting this to be the approximate shape. Now, is this the right method to go? I can't really say that for sure. But at the end, we'll have a nice clean surface that we can use, and we can extend this. And at some point we can use pull and pull it down. We're never going to be able to use these freeform tools to get all of these little details. It's just not what it's used for. So at some point, you're still going to have to make some prismatic parts. But if your end goal is to try to replicate this shape and do it quickly with as smooth as possible for that geometry, freeforms definitely, in my book, will beat using those mesh section sketches because we are pulling down to the mesh, but we're pulling down at each of these individual points, which means that we're spreading that out over, and the difference between each of those, the geometry is much smoother. But the key takeaway here is that you should really make sure that you have a consistent layout of edges. If you need to get more detail, you can add more edges, but try to do it with as few edges as possible. You can see the difference between this shape and this shape is very minimal. It's very minor. So if the lower version works for you, if this version has everything that you need, then by all means work with it with as few edges as possible because your geometry is going to be that much better. Now at this point we could carry on using surface tools. I could select this and try to extend it out further, and then use some of my other tools to begin cutting it away and adding those prismatic features. And that's something that we will likely do. It's not going to be in this video. I'm going to talk in the next video about trying to rebuild this or make this with prismatic features where we can add a true fillet to the corner and blend it and do that. So that's the direction I hope to go with this, but I at least wanted to just do a quicker video and show you how easy it was to use freeform tools for the same exact thing that we did in the first video. If you have any questions on this, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.